Hi, welcome to our CwC Creating with Code fourth project. We are doing our Sumo game. This project is pretty dense and there's a lot going on here, but I know you'll do well with it, and I think it's a really fun project to do overall. So make sure you download your asset package from Classroom or wherever I have it stored at the time, and you open up a new project, which we've done a couple times now. And I would like for you to take your asset package and then go ahead and just drag it into your projects area, and it'll ask you to import. And let's do that. So we'll talk about this game while this is importing. The idea of the game is going to be that you have a central platform and you will have a sphere on it that will move based on your camera's position. So as you rotate your camera, your sphere will move based on it. And we're going to make it so that you have enemies that spawn. But to make the game difficult is that enemies will come at you all the time, and they're going to try to push you off. And whenever you get rid of, say, 2 enemies, then it'll create a new wave of 3. It'll keep adding more enemies over time. So the game gets more and more difficult over time. But you will have some help because we'll also make it so you have power-ups that will come and go to give you different benefits. All right, so here we are with the scenes, and we're going to go to Prototype 4. So this is our central platform here that you can see. So currently in your hierarchy, you have a camera, directional light, we have a mist, and if I click on it, you can see in the game view, we get a little preview of what that looks like. You have your dome, which is just part of our environment, and then we have the island, which is another prefab. So we have 3 prefabs here, and they're already put into the world for you. So let's go ahead and start by making our player. I'm going to go over into my hierarchy, and we're going to just go ahead and use a primitive. Primitive are your basic shapes. So your cubes, your spheres, your cones, any of those. So we're going to go ahead and get a 3D object. We're going to get a primitive. We're going to get a sphere. And lucky for us, it just created it right here in the center. But if you didn't have that happen, then make sure you go over here to the inspector, hit these 3 dots, and then, oops, sorry, wrong one, over to the transform. I apologize. Transform. And then reset that position. So let's look. It's kind of small in the world. So what I probably would like to do is I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. I'm going to change the scale of this to 1.5, 1.5 on all 3 axes, 1.5. And we are just going right into the ground just a little bit. So I will change my Y. I'm going to move it up by 0.1. Yeah, that looks pretty good actually. So 0.1. And so our sphere is sitting right on top of it. Let's go ahead and change the name of the sphere to player. Capital P. Now, it doesn't really matter what you name this here, but if we reference the player in a script as a string, as we've done a couple times, then you want to make sure that you use the same name. So I'm going to ask that you use player and spell it the way that I do. But if you don't, just remember that you need to change that in a script if you ever reference it. Since we are going to be using physics in this, we are going to need a rigid body. We will be doing colliding, but this comes already with a sphere collider attached to it. So let's go add a component, and let's add a rigid body. Done. And I think everything that is on the rigid body is fine for now. I don't think we're going to be playing with any of this stuff for the time being. And then finally, let's go ahead and make this look a little bit nicer. It's just a white sphere at this point. It looks like a ping pong ball. We're going to add a texture to it. So go back to your assets, course library, source. Actually, no, sorry, I lied. There's a textures folder right here. And you have a couple different options for textures. So there's 2 ways you can add these. You can either take it and drag it onto the word player in your hierarchy, and now you'll have this texture packet, texture added to your player, or you can take it and just drag it onto your player in the scene, and it'll add it that way too. If you accidentally add it to something like your ground, you'll see that your ground looks kind of weird and stuff. You can hit Command Z to change that. The way that you know that it is on your player, you can click on player and scroll down, and you will see that on its material at the very bottom typically, it'll have the name of the texture that is on it currently. So you can choose any one of these that you want, but that's how you do that. And this is really useful. We can make this metallic. We can play with colors. We've talked about textures a little bit when we first started the class, but just note that this is, useful. This is how we can decorate our game and make it feel different. All right. So in this game, we're going to make it so that right now our camera is stationary, but we're going to make it so that our camera moves around, and our player is always going to move towards the center of this spot here in the middle. And we want our camera to move around the center spot as well. So we will probably need to create an object that our camera is always looking at and our player is always moving towards. So we're going to start by going over here to the hierarchy and creating an empty. Because all we want is just a blank object kind of sitting in space. So if it's off weird somewhere for you, make sure you go over here to the transform on this new game object and hit reset. And you should make sure this all in 0, 0, 0, all sit up there. And I'm going to change the name of this game object to focal point. Focal point being, press return, make sure it saves the name, and in the hierarchy it is saved. Focal point is just the center of our world or whatever. Once again, make sure you spell it like I do. Check that because we'll probably be looking for this specific name in a script later on. So we have that there. We got the name on it. Now let's go ahead and think about. So what we can do to make sure that the camera always stays based on this is I want to take my main camera and drag it onto my focal point to make it a child of the focal point. So the reason why we're going to do that is we want our camera to rotate. And if we just had a rotation on our camera, it would rotate in its own spot. It would just sit in the world and like spin around. Maybe if I take this out for just a second, I want to show you what I mean by that. So if I took my camera here, let me double click that. And if I was on rotate, if I had the camera rotate, what I would lose is sight of that island. My island is no longer the center of my view. And what I really want is the camera to rotate with the focal point. So drag that back under focal point. So what I can do to get the camera to spin around the center is just to rotate the focal point itself. So where is that? Right here. And now if I spin this, instead the center of the island is still the center of the game for me, which is exactly what we wanted. So we're probably going to need to make a script to control that. Let's go to our assets folder and let's create a new folder. We've done this every time. We're going to create a scripts folder. Scripts. There you go. And inside of that scripts folder, so I double clicked on it, I'm going to create a C# script. And let's call this one rotate focal point, because the way we're rotating our camera is by rotating the focal point. And so that's really what we're going to be rotating. I'm going to double click this to open this up inside of Visual Studio. And I intentionally tried to open Visual Studio beforehand so we wouldn't have this loading time. But Visual Studio has a mind of its own. Okay, now that we have the script open, let's think about what we would want to do. We would want to rotate in its normal position, just so sitting here in the world. The focal point is the only thing that's going to rotate. So I guess we need to ask ourselves, what axis is it rotating on? And since the axis that we want it to rotate on is the one that goes right through the middle going up and down, it's going to be the y-axis, so going up. And we've used up before. So how about right now, let's just try to get the camera to rotate smoothly. Let's just try to get it to rotate every frame. So let's do it in the update. So the component that we want to rotate with on our focal point is the transform. And we're going to say just transform dot rotate, so because we're using the rotation, and we want to rotate on the y-axis. So once again, see when I rotate this, the y number is the one that's changing. So let's go transform dot rotate. Open up some parentheses, and we want to say it's a vector 3. Vector 3, and on the up, because it's the y-axis that we want. And the last thing we want to do is the speed in which this is going to go to rotate. So we're going to just say 1 for now. And we know that we don't like having numbers down here, but we're going to do this for testing purposes. And put a semicolon. I'm going to save this. Go back into Unity. I have not applied this script yet to my focal point, so I'm going to do that now. So take this, and I'm going to drag it onto focal point, like that. And so what I should see is it rotating every frame at a speed of 1. Look at that. That looks pretty good. So if I wanted to make it go the opposite way, by the way, you could change that to a -1. Just to show you that, I'm going to press play. Let you see that in motion. But of course, we don't want this to go by itself. So we're going to want to turn this based on player's controls. So the player can move left and right. When they turn the camera, then the sphere will always move towards the center based on that. So first thing, let's get rid of this number down here. Let's create a variable for that to hold that information. That looks like we're using a, we can do this as a float or an int. I'll do it as a float for this one. So I just like to get rid of those comments sometimes. So a public float, and we will just call it speed. We'll call it rotation speed. How about that? Because that's really the speed we're controlling here. Rotation speed. And put a semicolon. Now, because I haven't set this value, or I haven't initialized it, I haven't set this up at the beginning of the game. So when this starts, then I need to do that in the inspector, and we make sure we don't forget that. And now I can replace this here with rotation speed. All right. Let's just make sure this works. I'm going to save that. And back in Unity, I should see now a public rotation speed. Right now it's set to 0, so it won't rotate. So I'm on my focal point. I'm going to then just change this to 1 again and just control it from here. And we should see the same effect we had earlier. Okay. But I'm going to do this based on the player's left and right keys. Now, we've done left and right controls before. In our very first project, we went and looked for an axis. We said if we want to go left and right, we need to find the axis for that. And that's underneath Edit, Project Settings, and Input Manager Axis. So if we want to go left and right using the left and right keys, then that was the horizontal axis. So we need to go get that axis. So I'm going to go back into Unity, and I'm going to create a public. Actually, this is just, yeah, we'll do a private. We don't need to see this. Private float, because it goes between 0 and 1, or 0 and -1. And we'll call this one horizontal. So this is left and right, horizontal input. Anytime you're using left and right keys, this is probably the best way to do that. And in our update, let's go ahead and set this number to whatever. So make this number set to whenever we're pressing a key. So we're always checking this. So horizontal input is equal to input dot get axis, and then we need to name the specific axis as a string. So it's a string. That's why it says right here, it says string. That's the correct name for this. So open up quotations and horizontal. Make sure you spell this correctly based on what your project settings were, and put a semicolon. Now, even though in the update, I'm always looking for this number based on if I'm pressing the left or right keys. We haven't done anything with it here, so let's go ahead and multiply it by rotation speed. So now that it's actually being used by the transform, times this variable here, yep. And then finally, since we're doing like a transform, we want to do it by time dot delta time, and let's save that. So let's check it out. We should be using our left and right keys to control the camera. So I'm pressing left, I'm pressing right, and man, this is very slow. I'm getting motion, but it is very, very slow. So I probably need to up my rotation speed. maybe like 50. Let's try that. Left, oh, that's a lot better. There you go. That looks good. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and save my game. I haven't done that recently, so Command S, that is totally saved. Great. So now, let's make it so that our player is moving. Because right now we're only moving a camera around a stationary object. So let's go to our scripts, and let's create a new script called player controller. Press return, and open that up in Visual Studio. All right, so we're wanting our player using its rigid body to move around the world. So if we're moving, we know we need a couple things. We need speed, and we're going to need to find the rigid body. So let's go ahead and set a variable for speed. So public, and this will probably be a float. I've done integers earlier on, just depends, whatever. Speed. And I'm not going to initialize it here. I'm not going to set the value here. I'm going to set it inside of the inspector. So I'll do it like that. I'm going to press return twice. I have a little room. And let's go ahead and set our rigid body. So private rigid body. And we'll call it player RB. Lowercase p, capital R, because that's our naming conventions. So since it's private, we're in a start method. Let's go ahead and find that. So you know how to find a component. We need to say, we're going to initialize it here. Get component, open carets, and we need to name the component we want to get. So what's on our player? We want to get the rigid body. We need to put these little parentheses for an argument, and then like that. So when the game starts, we will initialize, we'll go get that component, find the rigid body. So I guess how do we want our player to move? I guess we want to use the up and down keys so that it's moving backwards and forwards. Because the left and right is controlling our camera, but our player is always going to move back and forth to the center point. So let's go back to our project settings. And up and down keys are our vertical axis. So kind of like our Z almost, like backwards and forwards is the way I would see it. So let's name, I'm going to go back into my player controller. Let's name, the same way we created a input here, let's do the same thing for backwards and forwards on our player controller. So private float, and I'll call it Z input. So backwards and forward. We can call it forward input, whatever. I just want to make sure you understand that this is a Z. Instead of thinking vertical is up and down like Y. All right, so in our update, let's go ahead and set this to something. Let's say whenever we press left and right keys. So this input is equal to whenever we touch our input and we get the axis known as the string vertical and put a semicolon. Easy. Now the part where we're actually going to be moving it, we're not going to use like we did here with our transform on our our focal point. We're going to use the rigid body on our sphere, on our player. So since we're using the rigid body, let's call for it, player rigid body dot, and then we need to add a force because it's a physics object. So add force. So the things we need to know is what axis are we adding the force on, and then how much force are we adding? Well, we want to make it go forward on the z-axis. So vector3 dot forward, and we need to multiply it by our speed, how fast we want to go, and then of course that's multiplied by if we're pressing up and down, which is z input. We did this all in our first project. It might be a little rusty if you don't remember that. So I'm going to save that. And let's go see if this works. Now, it won't work yet because my player doesn't have it as a component yet. So I'll just take my player controller, drag it on, or you can search for it down there. And it looks like my speed is set to 0, so it won't go very fast. 10. Press play. Left and right, and if I press up, it goes away. If I press down, it'll come back towards us. Now, it's based on its own axis. So that works, but now it just goes back and forth based on its position, but I always want to go back and forth towards the center. Like kind of like Sumo. I want it to, like, if it goes to the edge, even if my camera rotates, it will find the center again. So the way to do that is we just need the position. We want forward to be the center of the game, not up and down directly. We want the center of the center point to be forward, no matter where it's at. So we need to find the focal point object and then change forward to be that. Sounds a little confusing, maybe. I don't know. I hope that it isn't. So there's two ways we can find the focal point. We could make a public game object, and then in the inspector, like, assign that over here in the inspector. But the way I want to show you this is probably the cleaner way of doing this. Like, for example, we could have done a public rigid body and just drug the player's rigid body into that slot. But we've learned that initializing in the start is a lot cleaner. Like, it will always find the right object, and it's not something we might forget. So we're going to do it this way too. We're going to find the correct object. So we're going to private game object, and we want to find the focal point. And in our start method, let's go get that thing. So we're going to say focal point is equal to find, game object, always forget to go game object dot find, open up some parentheses, and since this is a string name, we got to find a specific object. It has to be spelled exactly the same. Whatever your name is for your focal point, if you misspelled it, whatever, doesn't matter, just make sure you spell it exactly the same on line 15. Focal point, and then put a semicolon. So we'll find it. So now we can make forward basically replace our vector 3, not its own z-axis, but this as the basis of this axis. So line 22, I'm going to change this to focal point dot transform, its transform. Make sure I put that in the right spot. I think I transform dot forward. Save that. So now the focal points transform is the forward for our player. So, game object condition for. Oh, I think I spelled transform wrong. I know it was looking kind of weird. There it is. Save that. And let's see if we get this to work. We need to make sure that our player, everything is there. We got speed, all of that. So let's see if it finds it. So if I press forward and I rotate and I press back, see now it's kind of got this weird, like, oh, it will make forward. Yeah, it's like a sumo ring kind of thing. Yeah, it makes the game a little bit more difficult. Our goal will be now to make it so that we can move around doing that while other obstacles are hitting us. So very quick review. We are finding a rigid body here, not up here through the inspector, and we are also finding a focal point here, the center of our island, and we are moving always towards the focal point, making the focal point the top or forward on our z-axis, and then multiplying by if we press up or down. And that same thing's kind of working with our camera, where our camera is finding when we go left and right, then make sure that our camera's rotating with that focal point. All right, that's the end of this first video. The next one, we're going to start putting enemies in who are going to look for you. Just the same way your character's looking for the focal point, those enemies are going to look for you to try to always bump you off of the island.